All right, let's talk about the roles of each of the speakers. If you remember, here are the 4 speakers. All right, now, the Prime Minister who begins the debate, his role is, well, it's extremely important, and, well, let's just get on with it. Let's just forget about talking about how important it is. All right, now, nobody has spoken before him. He doesn't know what his opposition is going to say. He doesn't actually technically even know what his opposition is going to stand for, because they have not spoken one word in debate yet. It is the government's job in Canadian parliamentary debate to pick a motion. All right, so they'll choose a motion, and generally they can assume that the opposition will choose to defend the status quo. And so the motion could be like, this House believes that, this House will legalize assisted suicide, for example. And then you could generally reasonably believe that the opposition will choose the side of the status quo, which is assisted suicide is illegal, right? And this House could be defined as candidate, let's say, just to make things smooth, right? Now, Prime Minister's first thing he's going to do when he stands up for a 7-minute speech, right, is he's going to set up the problem. And that's just generally an introduction to have everyone know what the context is. And by this time, remember that the opposition doesn't even know. When the Prime Minister stands up to begin a 7-minute speech, the opposition and the judges do not know what the motion is yet. All right, and so they will have their pens ready, and they'll be as ready as possible. And of course, the judges will always have their pens ready, and so forth, right? And so it needs to be very clear exactly what the Prime Minister, he needs to know exactly what he's going to say and how he's going to set up the problem and define the motion, because the rest of the debate, which is like for the next half hour, both sides will be talking about exactly what he set up the motion to be, exactly what he defined the motion to be, and arguments will be made or, not made, depending on how the definition of the motion is. Like, for example, one very interesting debate was that the motion was like, this House believes that all countries should get rid of their nuclear weapons. And then opposition brought up a feasibility argument of like, oh, how is it possible to have North Korea get rid of their nuclear weapons and so forth? And then like the government said, well, this is not a stance to action. It's just a stance about whether they should or not, because the motion was actually this House believes that they should, not that this House will actually do it. And so the feasibility question is out of the question. Anyway, that's probably boring you, so let's go on. Setting up the problem is basically telling the judge exactly what happened and why you were setting up the motion. And so if the motion is, again, about legalizing assisted suicide, you would be setting up the problem by telling the speakers how things stand right now, today, in this House, which is, let's say, Canada. And then you could say that people are trying to commit suicide, maybe, and then you could talk about how doctors may even be morally in favor of assisted suicide. You can talk about whatever it is that you want to set up the problem to be, but you're trying to introduce the problem and in a sense of why you think the status quo currently is problematic, and therefore you're trying to find a solution to this problem. And the solution is the motion that you're going to give. One interesting thing about setting up the problem is that if you set it up in a correct way to prove that the status quo is problematic, then the opposition will have to either they will have to argue that the status quo is not problematic, or they will have to propose a different solution than yours. And so this is if you manage to properly construct the introduction as a problem, and then you define your motion, it can set up a very strong introduction to your motion. So setting up the problem is different than defining the motion. Is basically, well, it is what I said it was. Now, defining the motion is, I'll set up a link on examples of motion definitions, but another one that I can think of off the top of my head is the classic one, this House will legalize marijuana, or this House will ban alcohol, or this House, keep it going. The constructive is essentially the arguments that you're going to make. You're going to want to make them very clear arguments, like bullet point arguments. Generally, it could be anywhere from 2 to 4 arguments that the Prime Minister will set up. And he will name them, list them, and then go on to the details of each argument. I'll go on to make another video on how to properly set up arguments and how to get into each argument deeply with an example and all that, right? Now that's the job of the Prime Minister, and he's supposed to keep that under 7 minutes, of course, right? And then we go on to the opposition. Now the other three guys have very similar jobs, which are pretty different than the government, because every single other debater will already have heard a speaker from the opposite side of the House. And so every single one of them will now have the job to do rebuttal and refutation, which is something Prime Minister will not do. Some people like to do the refutation at the end of their speech, and some people prefer it in the beginning. It's really up to you. And what essentially that is that you have to take every single one of the points that the opposition brought up and either prove why it's wrong, or prove why your solution is better, or prove why it's a logical fallacy that they suggested that. Essentially bringing down their argument and bringing up your side of the argument. And so if rebuttal can be connected to your own constructive arguments, showing why not only is their side bad and your side good, or even if you can't prove that their side is bad, prove that your side is better, and so you win by that. Or even if you say, well, their side has some good points but has some bad points, then you can try to prove why, the negative sides overact the good sides. Had a bit of a brain stall there, just forget what I said that. All right, that's rebuttal, refutation, and then going on to your reconstruction as well. The opposition will generally have 3 construction arguments to make, 2, 3, whatever. And rebuttal is extremely important. Going on to the member of the Crown, Minister of the Crown. He will also, of course, need to incorporate his rebuttal for the opposition side and probably bring up one more point on his side that the Prime Minister didn't cover, or maybe he can deepen his Prime Minister's arguments. And so there is a rebuttal that he needs to do. There can be a constructive argument, a unique constructive argument that he can also bring up to help with the whole Prime Minister argument. And he needs to do reconstruction, which is essentially rebutting the rebuttal, or refuting the refutation that the opposition did on your side. And so if he made a point, right, then opposition proved to the judges, why that point was bad. It is his job to go back, refer to that point that the Prime Minister made, and then reprove, which is called reconstructive, why it actually still stands and why that point is still good. And again, reconstruction and rebuttal, which are very closely connected, right? One of them is arguing why your opposition's points are bad. The other one is arguing why actually your points are good, and the rebuttal that the opposition made is bad. Very closely connected to not only proving that your side is good, but proving that the enemy side is, well, the opposition side is bad. If you can manage to do both these things in your same argument, then you've made a really strong point, right? If you fail to refute what the opposition side has said, it's just like saying that your side's good, but you're not saying the other side is wrong or bad or illogical or anything. Then that stands as a win on your side and a win on their side, because failure to refute is the same thing as assuming or as passively agreeing with them, right? And so then what will happen in the end is that the judges will see these points, and they will see that this point was not refuted, and so it still stands even if it's a weak point. And so it's your job to make sure to refute, make sure that to have no arguments just left hanging and therefore by default winning on their side of the House.